Hi, everybody. So this week we have a lot to get through because we're covering the 1960s, and there was a lot that happened in the 1960s. So I'm actually going to do two lectures this week. This lecture is going to be all about the domestic politics of the 1960s. I'm going to concentrate here on the civil rights movement and how it evolves over the decade. And part of the reason why I'm concentrating on that is because a large part of domestic politics in this decade centered around the movement for desegregation and Black equality. And in my other lecture this week, I'll cover foreign policy and the war in Vietnam. So to get us started, let's talk a little bit about the big questions that we're going to be looking at this week. The first really is, how does the rights revolution evolve during the 1960s, and how did the federal government respond to these challenges? The power that was in the grassroots protest of the civil rights movement, the power that had unleashed was going to spread, and it would not be easily ignored. One of the biggest legacies of the 1950s and 1960s with the civil rights movement was what some historians have called the rights revolution, or the rise of what would come to be called identity politics. And the idea of identity politics really begins with the civil rights movement. Many people were inspired by this movement to raise their own voices, to express their own grievances, and to claim their stake and their rights in American society. And so by the mid to late 1960s, you start to see all these new social movements springing up. And this new focus on asserting identity and the rights that come with it. It spreads from the civil rights movement to other groups like Latino Americans, Native Americans, women, the gay and lesbian community. So we're going to be talking about some of the kind of larger legacies of the civil rights movement, and we're going to be looking at, to what extent was the civil rights movement successful? And these are some of the kind of bigger questions that I want you guys to think about this week. So to get into the civil rights movement in the 1960s, last time we left off talking about the Montgomery bus boycott, the challenges to desegregation that were being, sort of put in play in terms of the schools. The next kind of big turning point for the civil rights movement really came in the spring of 1960. And that started with what became known as the Greensboro Sitins. This really starts with some college students. 4 freshman students at North Carolina A&T College. They decided on February 1st, 1960, to go to the local Woolworths and to remain seated at the lunch counter until they were served. A little bit of background about the 4 young men who really started this movement. They were students at North Carolina A&T State University. This meant that they were members of the small but growing Black middle class in the South. And at least one of them was very active in politics. Ezell Blair was president of the Student Government Association. He was also the leader of the campus NAACP chapter and the Greensboro chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. So they weren't simply ordinary students. They had been active in civil rights politics on the local level, so they knew really what they were doing. And they were spurred on by a couple of factors. One of the students, a guy named Joseph McNeil, he had been frustrated with Southern racial segregation because he had lived for a long time in New York. And when he returned from a visit there during Christmas vacation, he was refused service at the bus terminal in Greensboro. And so this prompts him to enlist his friends to stage this sit-in at the Woolworths. And the students were also responding to the recent brutal lynching and murder of Emmett Till. One of the 4 Greensboro 4, a guy named Franklin McCain, he said the murder of Emmett Till sent him some messages. He said, "I concluded rather quickly that if that is all this life has to offer, then it's not worth living." But they decided that rather than to accept the reality of life in the segregated South, they were going to fight back. So these sit-ins were really revolutionary. And what was so revolutionary about them was that they spread very rapidly throughout the South. And this was facilitated by the networks that existed between the Black student organizations and, sort of other, kind of organizations within the Black community. A lot of these networks had already been established by older activists, and many of them were centered around the church. And it was really the first time you had a protest that had been devised and led and organized and carried out entirely by students. It was a youth-led movement. And they were really putting this ideal of nonviolence that Martin Luther King had kind of introduced into action. The sit-ins were really the first example of the kind of nonviolent protest that King and others have been talking about for years. So it really energizes the entire civil rights movement. And they were pretty successful on the whole. There were some incidents of violent retaliation, and many people were arrested. But communities throughout the South were eventually forced to desegregate commercial businesses as a result of this. And part of this had to do with just the level of commitment and discipline among the students. They understood exactly how they should act, how they should dress. They always behaved very politely, but they were very firm and unyielding in their demands. They basically would go into the, lunch counters and sit down, or go into whatever business it was and sit down and refuse to move until they were served, until they were given service. And white business owners in the communities were largely taken off guard by this new form of protest. They didn't quite know how to respond to these students. They were, these students weren't doing anything disruptive. They were just sitting there. And so this was something that was, sort of entirely new. They got a lot of support from older activists. That was pretty crucial. They helped to spread the idea by contacting student leaders around the South. They provided bail money to get them out of jail. They provided, meeting places. What results from the sit-ins is that it kind of engages the attention of the national media. This, practice starts to get publicized. And it actually prompts many white students in the North to join the protests in boycotting the national chains like Woolworth's. And it led to, kind of these white students, idealistic white students in the North, sort of really becoming involved in the movement. It was a way for them to actually get involved as well. The biggest result of the sit-ins was the establishment of a new organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, SNCC, SNCC. And it was formed in April of 1960. SNCC was very important to the civil rights movement as a whole. It was never a very large group, and it didn't get as much publicity as some of the other organizations, but it did a great deal to, as one historian put it, invent the 60s. They initiated this kind of mass-based, disruptive political style of protest that is associated with the 1960s. And they provided models and training for people who would become leaders in other movements. The student power movement, the anti-war movement, the feminist movement. So it really helped to kind of, catalyze all these other kind of movements as well. And SNCC was really instrumental in forcing the civil rights movement to go into some of the most dangerous areas of the South and pressure some of these older civil rights organizations to try to reconsider their tactics, to try to rethink the way that they were doing things. They pushed the idea that merely, sort of bettering the living conditions or gaining kind of legal rights for oppressed people wasn't enough. You had to actually give people a voice in decisions that shaped their lives. So this had to be a truly grassroots movement. It had to be from the local level. And these radical ideas that were emerging in SNCC really encourage a whole generation of scholars and activists to reconsider some of these commonly held ideas about social inequality. So it became a very influential organization, and it all comes out of the sit-ins in Greensboro. So let me talk a little bit about the 1960 presidential campaign because that kind of comes into play here as well. In 1960, the 1960 election was going to mark the end of 8 years of Eisenhower's presidency. And it seemed to really be kind of significant because this was kind of the end of the 1950s. It was the beginning of a new era. It was the first time that both candidates for president had been born in the 20th century. Now, on the Republican side, Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, he had been a very influential vice president, and he easily won the nomination. On the Democratic side, there was a very wide field of nominees, including a senator from Texas, Lyndon Johnson, senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey. The governor of California, Pat Brown, ran. The former Illinois governor and, perennial presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson, and the senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy had this very youthful image. He had the help of his father, Joseph P. Kennedy's political skills, and he was able to then carry the nomination at the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. The 1960 election is also considered significant because it's the first time there was a televised presidential debate. And this debate is very famous because supposedly Nixon, he refused to wear any makeup, and he had been kind of a little bit under the weather, and he appeared to look very tired on television. And this was in kind of stark contrast to Kennedy, who was tan, he was relaxed, and it's commonly repeated that voters who had listened to the debate on radio thought that Nixon had won, but the television audience gave the win to Kennedy. And so this is kind of an early indication of the power that television would come to have over American politics. Now, the actual campaign itself was really dominated by Cold War issues. The main economic issue during the election was the fact that the Soviet Union had a very high economic growth rate in comparison to the United States. And according to analysts at the time, the Soviet economy was expected to overtake the American economy by 1984. Kennedy, sort of made a lot of hay out of this, and he said, sort of the Soviets are winning, and, sort of we need to kind of rethink our strategy. He also claimed that the Republican administration, that Eisenhower's administration, had allowed a missile gap to emerge by not matching Soviet defense spending and allowing the military to weaken. And this claim seemed to be kind of plausible because just a few years earlier, the Soviets had started their space program in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik. And the U.S. hadn't really kind of been able to get its space program off the ground yet. There had been a number of launch failures and things, and so it wasn't really kind of going anywhere. But if you actually look at the numbers, there was never, ever an actual missile gap as far as the, number of actual missiles were concerned, but this only becomes clear after the election. So he's able to kind of, use this. The election was very, very close. Kennedy's margin of victory in the popular vote is to date the closest ever in American history. And there were some allegations of voter fraud in both Illinois and Texas, but Nixon refused to publicly contest the election results, and he said it would spark a constitutional crisis if he tried to contest it, so he didn't. And Kennedy becomes president. Kennedy's inaugural and his ascendancy to the presidency seemed to mark quite a change in American politics. And you can kind of see that in this photograph here. You've got, sort of vibrant, youthful Kennedy speaking at his inauguration, while behind him is sitting Eisenhower, and he's kind of representing the older generation. And it's for the first time, really, since Teddy Roosevelt, Americans had elected a very young president. Kennedy was only 43 when he was elected. And his inaugural address is on page 294 in For the Record, and you can read it a little bit. Essentially, his inaugural address is very famous, of course, for the line, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. He is talking about kind of passing the torch to a new generation. He says he commits the United States to some interesting kind of things. It's very much a Cold War address. He says that we, as the United States, is kind of prepared to, as he said, pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. So again, that's continuing that kind of idea of containment. It's continuing that idea of, being vigilant and hyper, sort of aware of what's going on around in the rest of the world and going wherever you need to try to contain communism. So it's very much a Cold War address. And notice that even though you have the civil rights struggle going on in the South, Kennedy does not mention segregation or race or anything in this speech. It shows he's interested in more in being a cold warrior than really in dealing with these issues at home. So we're going to talk a little bit about Kennedy as the cold warrior next time. But for now, let's kind of turn back to the issues of civil rights. So soon after Kennedy was inaugurated, civil rights was back in the headlines again with the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides were initiated by a group called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And this was a group that had formed in the North, in Chicago, during the 1940s. And it was particularly committed to this idea of nonviolent protest. They really wanted to use Gandhi's techniques of nonviolence and apply them to the problem of race in America. So in 1960, the Supreme Court issues a ruling that segregation in interstate bus terminals is illegal. And to test that ruling, CORE decides to send integrated groups of bus riders into the Deep South. And they call this new effort the Freedom Ride. So they would get black and white volunteers, many of them college students, to board buses in the North and travel down into the South to test the segregation of these bus terminals. So the first Freedom Ride began on May 4th, 1961 in Washington, D.C. 10 Freedom Riders boarded 2 buses that were bound for New Orleans. And most of the people on these buses were under 30. Most of them were men. They were evenly divided between blacks and whites. Now, arguably, the riders were not actually engaging in civil disobedience because they had a legal right to disregard the segregation laws in the states that they visited. They weren't actually breaking the law because the Supreme Court had declared interstate bus travel segregated interstate bus travel illegal. But the reality was their rights were not enforceable, and they remained criminal acts throughout much of the South. Despite the Supreme Court's decision, the prevailing patterns of law enforcement and local, kind of judicial decisions in the South meant that local and state governments in the South saw what the Freedom Riders were doing was unlawful. And they also had to rely on, kind of nonviolent resistance in facing both mob violence and the possibility of being arrested by authorities who were determined to stop this protest. So the Freedom Riders encountered a lot of violence throughout the South, particularly in Birmingham. The worst violence that occurred during the Freedom Rides occurred when the buses approached Birmingham, Alabama. The police chief there was a guy named Eugene Bull Connor. His nickname was Bull, which kind of gives you an indication of, what kind of a guy he was. He basically openly conspired with members of the KKK to beat and harass the Freedom Riders. And you can see this is a picture here of one of the buses that they were traveling on had been firebombed. And they were forced to exit the bus. The riders were forced to leave the bus, obviously, and then they were, beaten by the mobs who were around them. The U.S. Attorney General, JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy, he sends his assistant, a guy named John Siegenthaler, to accompany the Freedom Riders. And when the bus reaches the city of Birmingham, the Freedom Riders are viciously beaten by members of the Klan who are under police protection. And even Siegenthaler is knocked unconscious when he went to the aid of one of the passengers. And they were actually forced to take refuge from the mobs in a local church. So this is, sort of a lot of violence coming on. Eventually, the Kennedy administration sends in federal marshals, and he asks the governor to call up the National Guard to protect the Freedom Riders. So the ride ends up, sort of ending on May 25th, 1961 in Jackson, Mississippi, when the buses are met by this angry mob of white segregationists, and they are imprisoned by the local police. And they're imprisoned because there had been a deal made by the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, said, okay, you can take these guys and you can arrest them as long as you keep them safe. And so this was, sort of kind of a way for the Kennedy administration to try to kind of put down some of this violence and unrest that was going on. Why were the Freedom Rides significant? Well, they were facing a lot of resistance against their cause, obviously, but ultimately they developed very strong support from people both inside and outside the South for their efforts. And so they established a lot of credibility with both blacks and whites throughout the United States who became motivated to engage in direct action for civil rights. So they inspired a lot of people. And also, they ended up having a huge impact upon ordinary people, ordinary African Americans living in some of these rural areas throughout the South, who later ends up forming the backbone of the civil rights movement. So they inspire a lot of subsequent civil rights campaigns, including voter registration, the freedom schools that we're going to talk about, and also the Black Power movement as well. The Freedom Riders kind of place the Kennedy administration, though, in a very awkward position. The federal government couldn't very well allow the Southerners to ignore the law, ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court, especially not with the whole world watching. But interceding on behalf of the civil rights workers puts the Kennedy administration in a very tough position because Kennedy needs the support of politicians in the South, largely who are still mostly Democratic. So the Democratic Party is kind of experiencing this split between Northern Democrats, who are, very much in favor of, kind of civil rights, and Southern Democrats who very much are not. And so the Kennedy administration tries to diffuse the tension. They call for kind of a cooling off period. They try to encourage groups like CORE and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to focus on things like voter registration rather than these kind of dramatic confrontational direct action programs. They thought that voter registration would provoke a less violent reaction. Now, as we're going to see, that was not the case. But we do kind of get to, it kind of shows where the Kennedy administration's sort of head was at this point. So this kind of leads us into 1962, 1963. And by 1963, the civil rights movement is growing and some success has been achieved, but things seem to be kind of stalling. And Martin Luther King and the movement itself kind of needs this victory, needs a very dramatic confrontation to kind of get things moving again. And so they select Birmingham as kind of the target. And what happens at Birmingham, the protests there, really made a huge impact, and it's one of the kind of central events of the civil rights era. Obviously, Birmingham was chosen because it was such a hotbed of white supremacy and racism, really exemplified by the head of the police, Bull Connor. And so King goes into Birmingham. He is, arrested. He publishes his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. It's widely published, and you can read that. You'll be reading that for the discussion this week. The organizers of the protests organized marches of school children, and the violent reaction that they engendered were, sort of publicized throughout the world. So we had the media also kind of playing a huge role here. The media is broadcasting these horrifying pictures of children and teenagers being hit with fire hoses and attacked by police dogs, and people are just, sort of outraged and horrified at what they're seeing on their TV screens. And you have, kind of the unity of the Black community in Birmingham in the face of this kind of overwhelming brutality, really inspiring to a lot of people. So in part because of the events in Birmingham and elsewhere throughout the South, President Kennedy is finally forced to take a firm stand on the issue of civil rights. So on June 11th, 1963, the president goes on national television and he makes a speech calling for the banning of discrimination in public places. And it's a very moving speech. It recounts the long history of racial injustice in America. It goes all the way back to the Civil War and before. And Kennedy says, we are confronted primarily with a moral issue. He calls it a moral issue. He says it's as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. And he says this nation will not be fully free unless all its citizens are free. And so he says now is the time for us to fulfill that promise. So what Kennedy proposes in this speech would later become part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At the time, however, Kennedy still does not have the votes in Congress to push this legislation through. There is still a very, very large wing of the Democratic Party in the South that is adamantly opposed to desegregation and the civil rights movement, and Kennedy cannot afford to alienate these members of his own party. The other kind of major important moment in the civil rights movement in 1963 is, of course, the March on Washington. This was the largest public demonstration in American history to that point, and it's African Americans and white Americans coming together to push for civil rights legislation and other reforms like reducing unemployment, increasing the minimum wage, barring employment discrimination. And of course, this demonstration is very famous for Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. This is where he gives that famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And it's really this push for the federal government to do something, to act. Now, later that same year, tragedy ends up striking when the young president is killed by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy had chosen to visit Dallas for a few reasons. He was running for re-election, and so he is trying to get more campaign contributions to help, sort of begin his quest for re-election. And he's also trying to mend some political fences in the crucial southern state of Texas. And so it's planned that Kennedy would travel from the airport in a motorcade through downtown Dallas to give a speech at the Dallas Trade Mart. And the car in which he was traveling was a 1961 Lincoln Continental. It was a modified limousine, and it was a convertible, as you can see. There was no presidential car that had a bulletproof top in service yet in 1963. So just before 12:30 in the afternoon, Kennedy's limousine enters Dealey Plaza, and it slowly approaches and going past the Texas School Book Depository, and then it turns left 120 degrees directly in front of the depository. And when the presidential limousine passes the book depository and it continues down the street, shots are fired at Kennedy. The great majority of witnesses recall hearing 3 shots fired. The motorcade quickly speeds away to the nearby hospital where President Kennedy was declared deceased. Lee Harvey Oswald, he was an employee at the book depository, and he was reported missing to the Dallas police by his supervisor. And he was arrested an hour and 20 minutes after the assassination for killing a Dallas police officer who had spotted him walking along a sidewalk. And he was actually captured in a nearby movie theater. Oswald resisted. He attempted to shoot the arresting officer with a pistol, and then he was, restrained by the police. He was charged with the murders of Kennedy and the police officer later that night. Oswald denied shooting anyone, and he claimed that he was a pawn. And his case never actually ends up coming to trial because 2 days later, while being escorted to an armored car for being transferred from the police headquarters to the Dallas County Jail, he is shot and killed by another man, Jack Ruby. And you can see this is a famous photo. This was all being filmed, and so he was actually shot on live television. Vice President Johnson, who had been riding 2 cars behind Kennedy in the motorcade, and he was not injured, he takes the oath of office on Air Force One just before it departs Love Field, and he becomes the President of the United States. And of course, there's a sort of massive state funeral held. This is a very famous. The last picture on here is a very famous shot of Kennedy's young son saluting his father's casket as it goes by in the motorcade. So this was obviously a very traumatic event for the whole nation. And sort of people were, sort of really devastated by it. Now, as you read in the textbook, Kennedy was having a lot of trouble getting his domestic agenda passed because a coalition of Southern conservative Democrats and Republicans were continuing to block a lot of the reforms that he wanted to put through. After Lyndon Johnson assumes the presidency upon Kennedy's death, this situation rapidly reverses itself. Johnson had been in Congress, and he had been Senate Majority Leader. He was probably the most effective Senate Majority Leader in history because he was a master at getting people to do what he wanted. He was famous for what was called the Johnson treatment. He would get up in the faces of his targets and he would browbeat them and persuade them until they gave in. He was a very tall guy, and so he would literally sort of loom over people and kind of intimidate them into doing what he wanted. Johnson comes into office and he says he wants to continue Kennedy's legacy. Basically, he sort of cloaks himself in the mantle of this beloved slain president, and he says, if you want to honor Kennedy's memory, you will pass this legislation that he had proposed. So he is a very effective manager of Congress, and he's able to pass one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 makes it illegal to segregate public facilities. It establishes the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to lessen racial discrimination in employment. It also contains some provisions to protect the voting rights for African Americans. And there was an amendment added to the bill that was added by segregationists, actually, in an attempt to weaken the bill. An amendment was added to add gender to the prohibition of discrimination for employment and things like that. Essentially, they thought adding gender discrimination was such a ludicrous move that no one would vote for it. So this kind of shows just how much farther women's rights needed to be taken in 1964. The strategy ends up not working. The bill ends up passing anyway. So this is a major piece of legislation, and it really forms kind of the cornerstone of what would become known as the Great Society, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. So just after Johnson passes the Civil Rights Act, at this time he's sort of getting this legislation passed through Congress, on kind of the grassroots level, the civil rights movement is continuing. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee begins a campaign that's known as Mississippi Freedom Summer in the spring and summer of 1964. And this is basically a plan to register people to vote in rural Mississippi. It's a plan to bring white students from the North to Mississippi to help register voters and coordinate a massive turnout of votes in the election in the fall. The idea is that more media attention is going to lead to greater protection for civil rights workers. So Mississippi officials hear about this. They hear about what they're planning, and they begin literally gearing up for war. Newspapers in Mississippi constantly refer to this Freedom Summer Project as an invasion. And just after the Freedom Summer Project gets started in June of 1964, the first really horrific incidents of violence occurred. And this was the murder of 3 young civil rights workers. James Chaney, a 21-year-old black man from Meridian, Mississippi. Andrew Goodman, a 20-year-old anthropology student from New York. And Michael Schwerner, a 24-year-old social worker, also from New York. Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner were among the very first volunteers to arrive for Freedom Summer. They came to Mississippi on June 20th, 1964. And the next day they set out to look at the ruins of a local black church that had been burned there 5 days earlier. So they set out, traveling through Mississippi. At approximately 5 o'clock, their car is stopped by a county deputy, and he arrests the 3 men. They were all denied their requisite telephone call during their time at the jail. They were given dinner, and then they were released with orders to leave the county. And police followed them to the edge of town. The 3 men end up disappearing around 10 p.m. Police later found the charred remains of their station wagon, and for a while the trail goes cold. But the break comes when the FBI offers a $25,000 reward for news of the men's whereabouts. And on August 4th, 1964, they get a tip. The FBI finds the bodies of the 3 young men buried in a dam on a farm 6 miles southwest of Philadelphia, Mississippi. Subsequent autopsies revealed that Goodman and Schwerner had been shot, and Cheney had also been shot after being severely beaten. 18 suspects were put on trial in 1967 for this murder, but they were only put on trial for civil rights violations, and only 7 of those men were found guilty. No one was tried for murder, and the 7 men were given sentences of around 3 to 10 years, but none of them ended up serving more than 6 years in prison. And the words of the presiding federal judge, a guy named William Cox, gave an indication of Mississippi's version of justice at the time. He was reported to have said, "They killed 1 N-word, 1 Jew, and 1 white man. I gave them all what I thought they deserved." Now, in actuality, both Goodman and Schwerner were Jewish. He didn't, obviously realize that at the time. One of the mistrials in the case freed a man named Edgar Ray Killen. He was a local minister. He was thought to be the ringleader of the group that had killed Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And 4 decades later, after sort of some courageous investigative reporting by a local newspaper man, on January 7th, 2005, Edgar Ray Killen, who was then 80 years old, was charged with 3 counts of murder. He was accused of orchestrating the killings and assembling the mob that had killed the 3 men. And on June 21st, which was the 41st anniversary of the murders, Killen was convicted on 3 counts of manslaughter. And he received the maximum sentence, which was 60 years in prison. So eventually, sort of some justice was done. Now, the volunteers from SNCC who were training to go down to Mississippi, they heard about the disappearance and the, sort of murder of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, and it really brings home to them exactly what's at stake. They're literally risking their lives here. And everybody was given the opportunity to, bow out and refuse to go if they wanted to, but no one actually ended up taking the out. The majority focus of Freedom Summer was on voter registration. The movement went into some of these very rural areas in the South and basically trying to encourage people to register to vote. And they encouraged participation in what was called the Mississippi Democratic Party. And they set up, they were kind of, excluded and blockaded from actually, participating in the regular Mississippi State Democratic Party. So they set up what was called the Freedom Democratic Party. And this was a kind of alternate group to the regular Mississippi Democratic Party, one that was not segregated. And so the Freedom Democratic Party held alternate local caucuses. They held a statewide meeting to elect delegates to the National Democratic Party convention that was scheduled for later that summer. So the plan for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was to elect delegates to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, and then try to have them seated at the convention as the delegation, as the official delegation from Mississippi. So they elected a bunch of delegates, and they went to Atlantic City to go to the Democratic National Convention, and they demanded to be seated as the delegation from Mississippi. They argued that they were the legitimate delegation because they had run the only primaries that were open to all citizens, regardless of race. Now, this was very inconvenient for the president. Johnson was trying to get elected again. He was, sort of planning the convention as kind of this triumphant celebration of his administration's achievements in civil rights. And so he didn't really want to have a fight over racism within the Democratic Party itself. And Johnson was also very worried that, the Republicans were making inroads in this so-called solid South that had been, sort of solidly Democratic for so many years. Other all-white delegations from other southern states had threatened to walk out if the all-white group from Mississippi was not seated. So President Johnson was very worried about what might happen. Now, in order to be recognized as the official delegation from Mississippi, they had to present their case before the so-called Credentials Committee of the Democratic Party. And the highlight of the testimony that was presented before the committee was a speech by this woman here in this picture, a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer. And she recounted all the violence that she and other people had experienced. And she concluded by asking very impassionedly, "Is this America?" And this was all televised on national TV. Lyndon Johnson's watching this coverage from the Oval Office, and he's realizing how dangerous Hamer's testimony potentially was. And so he immediately calls a press conference, which basically forces the television coverage away from the credentials hearing, but to no avail. Then that evening, the networks rebroadcast her testimony before a primetime audience. And the next day, newspapers run photographs of Fannie Lou Hamer arm in arm with the family of Michael Schwerner, one of the slain Freedom Summer volunteers, and telegrams flood in from all over the country urging that the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party be seated. Johnson's strategy here was to offer the Freedom Party a compromise. So they said, okay, instead of all your full delegates, 68 delegates being seated as Mississippi's delegation, we'll let you have 2 delegates to be seated at large, while the entire segregationist delegation from Mississippi's regular party would be seated. And the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party would not even get to choose which delegates they got seated. They would be chosen by the National Party leadership. And the deal also included some things saying, okay, well, in future we're going to be better. And in 1968, at the next convention, the delegation, from Mississippi has to be fully integrated. Not surprisingly, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party rejects this really bad deal. And this is really a turning point for the civil rights movement in a lot of ways, because up until that point, a lot of people in the movement really believed that the federal government would protect citizens from bigoted and racist state governments, and that the National Democratic Party would protect citizens from these state parties, which were heavily segregated and heavily white supremacist. And this incident really showed people in the movement that white leaders would not exert a huge amount of effort to help Black Southerners. And it didn't matter whether they were national leaders or state leaders. After 1964, a lot of people came to the realization that they're just going to have to rely on themselves, and they have to kind of turn in some new and some more revolutionary directions. Now, as I mentioned, 1964 was an election year, and Johnson is trying to kind of secure legitimacy for his presidency with a big win. Johnson had already established kind of a reputation as a reformer, but he still needed to win the election. And he was vulnerable in the South. He had made all these pushes for kind of very liberal legislation, especially when it came to civil rights. And so he was vulnerable. And the Republicans kind of seized upon this opportunity by nominating a very conservative candidate for president in 1964. And that was Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a senator from Arizona. He was extremely fiscally conservative. He was militantly anti-communist. And a lot of moderate Republicans really didn't like him. They didn't want him to be the party's nominee. He ends up winning the California primary. He ends up securing the nomination. And he famously declares in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." He believed in a very limited role for federal government. He advocated very aggressive tactics to prevent the spread of communism. And so he's painted in the general election as this really dangerous figure by the Johnson campaign. Goldwater's slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right." And a lot of Johnson supporters end up coming up with, sort of riffs on that. They say, sort of like, "In your heart, you know he might," i.e. might start World War III, and "in your guts, you know he's nuts." And so Johnson campaigns ends up running this very famous television commercial highlighting the threats posed by Goldwater. This is known as the Daisy ad, and it's one of the kind of most famous political ads in American history because it shows, it's a very interesting ad. It shows at the beginning this little girl in a field, and she's plucking petals off a daisy, and she's counting down the petals. And when she gets to one, you see the, kind of picture starts to zoom in and focus on her, and it gets to one, and you hear this kind of, sort of looming sound in the background, and then there's this giant nuclear explosion. And it says, over the voiceover over this giant nuclear explosion says, you have a choice between, sort of going, into the dark or, embracing, sort of the light, and vote for Johnson in November. And it's really quite the striking ad. It was only, sort of run one time. It was immediately pulled, but then the ad ended up appearing on the nightly news, and so, sort of the point was kind of made. In the end, Goldwater only ends up receiving about 38% of the popular vote. And he only ends up carrying 5 southern states and barely wins his home state of Arizona. Johnson wins an enormous electoral college victory, 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 52. The election was not really a referendum on, foreign policy or anything. It was more that Americans were kind of turned off by Goldwater's extreme brand of conservatism at this point. So he's won the election very handily, and Johnson then kind of goes on very quickly to secure his legislative goals. He really wants to expand on the legacy of the New Deal and to tackle the problem of poverty in America. He had very ambitious goals for doing that. And most of what comes to be known as the Great Society ends up getting passed in 1965. Johnson, as I said, was a very firm supporter of FDR's New Deal, and he wants to take those reforms even further to secure his legacy as kind of, this progressive reformer. So healthcare had a top priority. So Johnson ends up passing both Medicare and Medicaid, mandated health insurance for elderly people, a healthcare program for poor Americans. He passes the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which bans things like literacy tests. It provides for, sort of federal oversight to ensure that African Americans can vote. And other legislation gets passed as well, including things like highway safety laws, clean air and water legislation, public housing, immigration reform, funding for the arts, the establishment of things like PBS and NPR all come out of the Great Society. So it's this really kind of sweeping period of legislative reform in American history. The other kind of sort of pillar of Johnson's Great Society was what was called the War on Poverty. And this really came home to Americans with the publication of a book called The Other America. And this was published in 1960, so it had been published, sort of prior to Johnson's administration. But it really kind of looked at the problem of poverty in America from a very kind of, deep and systematic way. And, all of the, on the TV screens in America, all this material abundance was being celebrated. But behind all of that was the reality that millions and millions of Americans were poor. Not everybody was sharing in the expanding economic pie. African Americans, of course, had been systematically excluded from entering the kind of middle-class suburban lifestyle. There was a lot of racial segregation in these new suburban communities. About 20% of Americans were actually considered poor in 1960. A lot of them were rural Americans who had been driven off the land. They were elderly. They were minorities. And they had largely been forgotten. Aside from racism and prejudice, the general attitude of, indifference towards people who are poor kind of stemmed from this idea that, well, American economy is doing great and a rising tide lifts all boats. And American economic abundance would eventually reach everybody. But the nature of poverty in America was changing. Before World War II, it had been predominantly a rural problem. But by 1960, about 55% of the poor were actually living in cities, and another 30% lived in small towns. A lot of these were, displaced farm workers. Most of them were African Americans with very few skills, very low education. Poor whites were living out of sight in very rural areas, and many of them were elderly. And Johnson really makes the issue of this other America central by launching what he calls the War on Poverty. He takes over proposals that Kennedy had been developing and he makes them his own. And he fashions this comprehensive anti-poverty program. And the amount given to this program totaled $1 billion, which at that time was quite a lot of money. So he sets up an organization called the Office of Economic Opportunity, and this sets up a wide variety of programs, things like Head Start, affordable preschool for people, the Job Corps, which was a training program for high school dropouts. The emphasis here was on self-help. The government would provide money and expertise, and the poor people would, sort of apply for these programs, and they would be able to kind of lift themselves out of poverty in that way. Now, the funding was never adequate enough to actually reach those goals. And there were a lot of, programs that ended up being very flawed and very, sort of bureaucratic. But it did have a pretty profound effect. It reduced the number of Americans living in poverty by nearly 10 million. And the majority of the beneficiaries of these programs were the elderly and the rural poor. So it did have quite a significant impact upon poverty in the United States. Now, as the Johnson administration is confronting this problem of poverty and economic injustice, the civil rights movement is also starting to tackle this issue. They had achieved success in desegregating schools and other public places. They had secured voting rights for African Americans. Now the movement begins to turn in a new direction to confront a more endemic problem, and one that can't necessarily be solved through sit-ins or marches or legislation. So we start to see the movement kind of turning towards issues of economic justice. In 1964, Martin Luther King called for what he called a Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged. And this was directed against poverty in general, but addressing in particular the persistent discrepancies between whites and blacks when it came to employment and wages. Other leaders proposed what they called a freedom budget, calling for $100 billion to be spent on job creation and urban redevelopment. King also goes to the North, and he starts launching programs in Chicago, a movement known as the Chicago Freedom Movement, demanding an end to employment discrimination, equal access to mortgages, public housing integration, low-income housing construction. And he starts to, kind of confront this issue of economic inequality. As this happens, you start to see a wave of violence in major American cities. The first of these riots, battles between black residents of, kind of urban communities and the predominantly white police, happens in Harlem in 1964. The following year witnesses the Watts Uprising in 1965 in Los Angeles, which was a predominantly black neighborhood. 50,000 people attacked police and firemen. They looted white-owned stores. Buildings were burned. 15,000 police and National Guard had to be brought in to restore order. And at the end of the riot, there was $30 million worth of damage. 35 people had been killed. This violence really escalates from there. By the late 1960s, riots had become so endemic that the Johnson administration appoints a commission to study the causes of urban rioting. And the commission's report, which was issued in 1968, blames the violence on segregation and poverty and white racism. And it says, our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. But what should be done about this problem, the report didn't really offer any clear answers about this. One individual who thought or who sort of proclaimed to have the answer was Malcolm X. He was a very fierce critic of integration and nonviolence, and he argued that African Americans should take the power back into their own communities and control political and economic resources rather than work with white Americans. He called the American dream an American nightmare. Now, so he's very active in kind of the early 1960s, and in particularly the sort of Muslim community. He begins to change his attitude a little bit after he goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964. He comes back to the U.S. and he begins to talk about, sort of interracial cooperation for radical change. In 1965, he was assassinated by other members of the Nation of Islam. He didn't really leave kind of a coherent ideology or a movement, but his ideas about African Americans controlling their own economic and political destinies were very influential among the younger members of the civil rights movement, who begin to talk about this idea of Black power. And this term comes really to national consciousness in 1966, when the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a young man named Stokely Carmichael, he speaks about it during a march in Mississippi. And it becomes this kind of rallying cry with people who were really fed up with the federal government's inaction and the movement's failure to address some of these economic problems that are endemic among Black communities. And so these younger civil rights activists are becoming increasingly radical. Now, accompanying this kind of idea of Black power is also kind of a cultural awakening. African Americans begin talking about how Black is beautiful. They start using the term African American rather than Negro. They begin to, sort of look back towards African culture for inspiration. Sort of this is when we start to see people wearing afros and, kind of expressing their racial pride. Groups like SNCC and CORE begin to repudiate ideas of interracial, sort of integration. And you start to see new, more militant groups spring up. And the most prominent of these is, of course, the Black Panther Party. This was a group that was founded in Oakland in 1966. And they advocated armed self-defense in response to police brutality. And of course, sort of visually, this was very striking. You have, sort of all these guys walking around wearing, sort of military garb and carrying weapons. They also, and this is kind of what they're mostly known for, but they also did some really great things in their communities. They ran health clinics, schools, they served breakfast for poor children in Black communities. So they were really all about trying to kind of put these ideas of Black power into practice. And so we start to see the civil rights movement is really kind of changing at this point. It's changing direction in some ways. And so this brings us to the year 1968. And 1968 is a really, really interesting year for a lot of reasons. It's often seen as kind of the culmination or maybe the end of the 1960s. It was a really, really turbulent year, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And sometimes you see that there's this kind of, turning point year where, just everything seems to happen. And it's a turning point in the Vietnam War, as we're going to see. It sees the assassination of a number of prominent leaders. It's a year of massive protests in the streets of America and across the globe. It's a presidential election year, of course, and it's a really pivotal election, as we're going to see. So 1968 is kind of, sort of this culminating point to all of this that has been building up. And of course, one of the first kind of events of this very turbulent year was the assassination of Martin Luther King. Many historians kind of see King's assassination as essentially the end of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Of course, it doesn't mean the end of civil rights activism, but after that point, the movement is never going to kind of be what it was before. Now, by the later 1960s, King's role in the movement was really kind of starting to lessen a bit. He was growing increasingly kind of despondent over the fact that this, idea of nonviolence seemed to be, sort of less and less popular. It was, sort of there was so much violence going on. And he was also beginning to embrace larger issues than simply fighting Southern segregation. In 1967, he comes out strongly against the Vietnam War. And a lot of his colleagues in the black community were unwilling to take that stance because they were afraid of alienating their allies in the Johnson administration. So he gets a lot of criticism for this. He also begins to fight for economic equality. He is starting to work to organize what he calls a poor people's campaign that would mobilize the economic underclass, both black and white, to fight for economic justice. Now, in the middle of all this, early in 1968, King is drawn into a labor conflict in Memphis, Tennessee, between the city and its sanitation workers. Most of the garbage men, the sanitation workers in Memphis, were black. They were grossly underpaid. They worked under really dangerous conditions. And he goes to Memphis several times to help try to organize the community there. And it's there that he gives his last and one of his most famous speeches, known as the Mountaintop Speech. He gives this on April 3rd, 1968, which is the night before he is killed. And the speech was almost prophetic. He talked about how he's no longer afraid of what would happen to him, that he had been shown the promised land, but that he might not reach it with his fellow citizens. And then that following afternoon, King is assassinated while he is standing on the balcony of a hotel by a lone white gunman. After King's death, black neighborhoods all across the country erupt in violence. And this really seems to be kind of this crossroads concerning race relations. Many people were genuinely afraid that this would be kind of, a turning point, a kind of catalyst for some kind of race war. And it seemed like that might actually happen for a while, but things end up quieting down. And King's assassination is really kind of a point of convergence for three kind of important forces that are shaping the issue of race in the 1960s. You have kind of the end of the civil rights struggle as a distinctive activist social movement. You have the increasing radicalization of African Americans. And you also have the manifestation of a so-called white backlash against the civil rights movement. So all of this kind of converges with the assassination of Martin Luther King. Now, just a few months later, we have another prominent leader is assassinated. In March of 1968, after he is very narrowly defeated, or he very narrowly defeats an anti-war candidate, Eugene McCarthy, in the New Hampshire primary, President Johnson announces that he's dropping out of the presidential race. And McCarthy's candidacy was sort of this, he was representing some of the kind of, disaffected youth of America. It was an anti-war candidacy. He starts to attract a lot of young people who are still idealistic about changing the course that America seems to be set upon. Now, when Johnson gets out of the race, Bobby Kennedy comes in. And Bobby Kennedy's candidacy energizes even more people. Kennedy, of course, is the brother of John F. Kennedy, who is still a very beloved figure among many left-leaning Americans. He was the senator from New York. He had spoken out against a lot of different issues, things like South African apartheid. He helped to start a successful redevelopment project in Brooklyn. He had gone down to the Mississippi Delta as a member of the Senate committee who was reviewing the effectiveness of the war on poverty programs. He comes out strongly against the Vietnam War. He really kind of endears himself to minority groups, immigrant groups. He speaks about what he calls the disaffected, the impoverished, the excluded. He aligns himself with the leaders of the civil rights struggle and social justice campaigners. And he really seems like he's trying to lead the Democratic Party in pursuit of a more aggressive agenda to eliminate discrimination. He supports desegregation busing. He supports the Voting Rights Act of 1965, anti-poverty social programs. So he's running on this ticket of racial and economic justice, of non-aggression in foreign policy, on, sort of social improvement. And this is really, really, sort of galvanizing for a lot of people, particularly for young people. He talks about young people as being kind of the future of a reinvigorated American society. On April 4th, 1968, Kennedy learned about the assassination of Martin Luther King. He's in Indianapolis at the time, and he gives a very heartfelt impromptu speech in the middle of Indianapolis. He calls for racial reconciliation. And as I mentioned, there were riots across the country in, over 60 cities in the wake of King's death. But no riots happened in Indianapolis, and many people attribute that fact to this particular speech that Bobby Kennedy gave. So he's really seen as this person who can maybe heal the nation's deep wounds over the war, over race, over poverty, over injustice. So it looks like he's on track to win the nomination. On June 4th, 1968, Kennedy wins the California primary, and it seems like he might be able to win the Democratic nomination for president. In the early morning hours of June 5th, he's at a ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and he's addressing his supporters after he's won the California primary. He leaves the ballroom through a service area to go back to the hotel's kitchen to greet some of the workers back there who were also supportive of him. And as he's going back to the kitchen, he is shot by a 24-year-old Palestinian, radical guy. He opens fire on him. He kills him at close range, and he is, sort of killed. Now, this is the second assassination of a major political figure in just a few months. So it's obviously very traumatic for many people, particularly for those Americans who still believe in this idealistic idea of the 1960s and the idea of social change and everything. These two major figures, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, had been killed, and this just seems really disheartening for a lot of people. After Bobby Kennedy's death, the Democrats are very deeply divided between the party establishment, which is supporting the vice president, Hubert Humphrey, and the more liberal supporters of Kennedy and McCarthy. There's this very big split in the Democratic Party. And the Democrats were to gather in Chicago in August for their nominating convention. And everybody expected this to be a very divisive event. But I'm not sure that anybody anticipated just how divisive it was going to be. The mayor of Chicago, a guy named Richard Daley, he was bound and determined that this was going to be a successful convention, and he repeatedly says we're going to maintain law and order. And he's taking a particularly hard line against protesters who are planning to come and protest at the convention. He refuses to grant them permits for rallies and marches, and he calls for the use of whatever force is necessary to subdue these crowds. So we have anti-war demonstrators protesting, sort of outside the convention hall. Initially, the protests are uneventful. Gradually, things start to get more heated. Soon, you have police and protesters clashing all around the convention center, in the streets, in the parks, and basically what ends up happening is that the Chicago police go a little crazy, and they just start attacking everybody, they attack anybody who's out on the street, basically. Even a member of the British Parliament who was vacationing in Chicago at the time, she was just walking outside of her hotel and she's maced and, sort of arrested and hustled off to jail. So anybody is, kind of attacked by the police. Inside the convention, things are only slightly less turbulent. You have anti-war Democrats who are attempting to get the party to embrace a peace plank in its platform. When those efforts are rejected, the delegations from New York and California begin to sing "We Shall Overcome." More delegations are marching around the convention floor in protest. And the television cameras are covering all of this. And so it's, impossible for the convention planners to hide the fact that the Democrats are hopelessly divided. There's rioting going on in the streets. And this is just a, sort of disaster, basically. This brings us to Richard Nixon and how he wins the presidency in 1968. Now, of course, we've seen Nixon before. He was Eisenhower's vice president. Of course, we met him back when we were talking about anti-communism in the 1950s. He was a member of the House and then the Senate in the 1950s, and he, sort of was virulently anti-communist. He kind of gains fame as a congressman from his anti-communist activities. And then he, sort of has this sort of long storied political career. And of course, in 1960, he runs for president against JFK. The race is very close. Nixon is narrowly defeated. He comes back in 1962. He runs for governor of California, and he suffers another defeat against Pat Brown. And so he is tired from years of campaigning and losing. He blames the media for losing the election. And he famously says in his press conference in his concession speech that this is going to be his last press conference. And he says, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." So he's, sort of ostensibly getting out of politics. He moves to New York. He becomes a partner in a law firm. But he kind of quietly starts to rebuild his base in the Republican Party by campaigning for other people. And so he comes back in 1968 and secures his party's nomination, and it's kind of seen as this remarkable comeback. He campaigns on this theme to restore what he calls law and order. And this appeals to a lot of voters who are angry at the hundreds of violent riots that had taken place across the country in the previous few years. After Dr. King's murder in April, there was severe rioting. President Johnson had to call out the U.S. Army to protect, sort of Washington, D.C., basically. So Nixon is really campaigning on this. He also developed what was called the Southern Strategy. And this is designed to appeal to conservative white Southerners who had traditionally voted Democratic, but they were angered by the Democratic Party's official support for civil rights. And this is going to proved to be enormously effective for the Republicans in subsequent elections. It's going to become a real staple of Republican presidential campaigns. Basically, not, sort of overtly, sort of presenting racial or kind of white supremacist arguments, but appealing to, sort of these Southern Democrats who didn't like the fact that, the Democratic Party had embraced civil rights wholeheartedly. Nixon also campaigns. He says he has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam, but he doesn't really provide any details about how that's going to happen. But all of this is very, very appealing to a lot of people in the country in 1968. And as we're going to see, he ends up winning the nomination, and he ends up, sort of having a rather eventful, sort of administration as president. But we'll get to all that later. All right, so that's it for this lecture. I'm going to talk in the next one about Vietnam and how we get involved in Vietnam, how this, sort of war evolves, and, sort of what the effects of it are. And I will see you guys in the next lecture.